Chapter 686 The Chosen One 2. Yua. Yua. A newborn infant's cries reverberated in the background as two gentle hands wrapped around the small frame of its body in an attempt to soothe its cries. Hush, Kevin, don't cry. Mommy's with you. Is this what it feels like to be a newborn human? Kevin's crimson eyes stared at his two small hands that were reaching out, grasping the air above him for some unknown reason. In the instant that Kevin was born, he already knew his mission. From the moment he felt the gentle embrace of his mother's warm hands as she wrapped them around his body and surrounded him with warmth, he was aware of the purpose behind his existence as well as the mission that he had to complete. Defeat Jezebeth. The cancer that the records were afraid of. The one singular entity that was disrupting the balance of the universe. That was his sole and only purpose for existing. Why is his hair white and why are his eyes red? Kevin, who had just been born, heard his parents' shocked and bewildered voices as they drifted gently in and out of his field of hearing. When he looked up, he saw the faces of two people, one male and one female, looking down at him with curiosity. These must be the people who have birthed me. Kevin pondered as he observed the two humans, who were staring at him with confused expressions. They had relatively delicate facial features, but their clothing appeared unremarkable and they appeared somewhat filthy. From what Kevin could gather, their names were Margaret and Jonathan. At least that was what they seemed to call each other. In spite of their filthy appearances, they had friendly expressions, and the sight of their smiles was not displeasing to the eyes. At least to Kevin, but he didn't seem to care all that much about it. In his mind, these were the two beings that would help him gain a foothold in this world before he could finally mature and leave on his own. He didn't have any particular attachment to them. The DNA test says that it is our child. Maybe he was just born with some strange illness or something along those lines. I'm not entirely sure. The man on the left, who appeared to be his father, was seen tenderly caressing the woman, who was described as having brown eyes and long black hair. Her features were soft and Kevin couldn't quite put his finger on what it was that made her smile so compelling. Nor did he care to understand. But if there is one thing that I'm sure about. As Kevin's father leaned in to give him a kiss on the cheek, the top of Kevin's head dampened. It's that he's our son. I'm sure it was an accident. He definitely didn't do it on purpose. Kevin stood by and watched as his mother pleaded in front of three people. The subject of everyone's attention right now was a young child who stood in the middle of the other two adults and appeared to have tears forming in his eyes. An accident? A round woman with curly yellow hair and an angry and repulsed expression on her face pointed an accusatory finger at her young child while raising her voice. How are you going to explain this? Her finger touched the child's eye, which was currently black. Your delinquent child punched my child for no apparent reason. How can you explain to me the black eye on his face? That. Margaret looked at the eye for a moment and she turned to look at Kevin. Biting her lips, she asked, Kevin, did you do this? Kevin remained silent and simply looked at her the whole time. He had never actually punched the child in the first place. It was another bigger kid, but the victim decided to lie and shift the blame for the attack onto Kevin out of fear for the bigger kid. Kevin could tell right away that saying anything would be pointless. It would probably go to death's ears. The people here weren't looking for the real culprit but for someone to blame the situation to. With Kevin being the preferred target due to his background. In addition, because this establishment was in a rather poor condition, there were no cameras to provide evidence to support his claim. Talking was a waste of energy. See, your child isn't even denying it. The woman yelled and pointed angrily at Margaret, whose face suddenly turned pale. He didn't even say anything. How can you just Oh, stop it. We both know your autistic son did it. As soon as the word autistic was mentioned, Margaret's face immediately froze, and she began to bite her lips more forcefully while murmuring in a voice that was only audible enough for Kevin to hear. My son is not autistic. How are you going to make up for what your son did? The woman continued to bother Margaret until she finally looked up and slowly stood up. She took a deep breath and turned her head to smile at Kevin. Her smile was an attempt to convey the words, everything is fine, I'll handle this, but it looked more forced than anything to Kevin, who simply stared at her emotionlessly. How much? How much what? The woman asked, crossing her arms. Margaret repeated herself, pulling out a small worn-out purple pouch. How much are the hospital fees? I will pay. She took several bills from her wallet, her hand attempting to remain steady. Despite her efforts, they still shook slightly. Before uttering a price, the woman deliberated for a short while, during which she stole a quick glance at the cash that was being removed from the wallet and raised 5 of her fingers. 500 you. I'll let this matter slide if you give me 500 you. 500 you. Margaret's hand stiffened and her face became increasingly pale. After taking a few deep breaths, she looked at Kevin once more before reaching into her wallet, pulling out a banknote and slowly passing it to the other woman, who quickly snatched it away from her hands. I'll take that. At long last, the lady cracked a grin of contentment. It was clear to Kevin that this was the woman's real goal from the very beginning and that they had just been scammed. I'll let matters slide this time. After giving Kevin one final menacing glance, the woman turned around and walked away with her son, leaving Kevin and his mother standing together in the empty corridor. Why is she doing this? Kevin questioned this as he looked at his mother with a puzzled expression on his face. Sincerely, he did not comprehend the reason why her mother would go to such great lengths for him. She was not required to pay the money. The worst-case scenario was that he would be expelled from kindergarten, but it wasn't a big deal because what he was learning was useless. In addition, he avoided them on purpose so they wouldn't become too attached as he didn't care about them, but for some reason they refused to ignore him. Why is that? Kevin wondered. Let's go, Kevin. Kevin was dragged out of the corridor by the hand and led to the building's exterior, where a man dressed in rather soiled clothes and a bright green construction uniform appeared, running up to them. He had a rather anxious look on his face as he rushed toward their side. How was it? Is there anything wrong with Kevin? No, nothing at all. I've managed to sort out the situation, Margaret said with a forced smile on her face. She looked at her husband and mumbled. Judging from your clothes, you must have directly rushed from work. Will you be fine? Sort of. I told my boss that there was an emergency with Kevin. He's understanding. At most he will deduct my pay, but that's fine. Jonathan took off his bright yellow hat and scratched the top of his head before putting it back on and adjusting his clothes. Honestly, I'm glad that I wasn't there on time. I think the situation would have been worse had they seen the clothes that I'm wearing. Those kids might even end up bullying Kevin for it. You're right. Kevin's mother nodded and a warm smile appeared on her face. Tugging Kevin by the hand, she nudged with her hand. All right, how about we go be? It was then that it happened. The world began to twist around them and the ground beneath them visibly shook. Beep, beep, beep. The sky turned from an azure color to a red color, and the alarms of the cars around them started to go off uncontrollably. What's going on? What's happening? After the sudden shaking of the ground, the first thing the couple did was bring Kevin into their embrace. At the same time, they looked around with looks of confusion and anxiety etched across their faces. A rusty smell suddenly permeated the air and Kevin's eyes dilated slightly. It's the demons. Kevin spoke, his voice monotonous and his crimson eyes gleaming under the moonlight. His parents showed startled looks the moment Kevin spoke as they both snapped their heads to look at him. What did you say? Demons? What are you talking about? Kevin didn't answer and continued to stare at the sky with an emotionless look. Kaya. The answers to their questions came to them quickly in the form of a dark humanoid creature that appeared in the air and a red ecliptical sun that shone down upon the world and caused enormous flames to emerge. Screams of terror resounded throughout the atmosphere as buildings started to crumble right before their very eyes. Hiya! Someone help me! Rumble. The environment was in complete anarchy. Flames that seemed to burn endlessly consumed everything that was within sight, and buildings continued to collapse. What had been a normal, peaceful day in a small village located not too far away from Ashton City turned into a scene straight out of hell. Within the span of a couple of minutes, the world crumbled apart and all hell broke loose. Fwape. Huge creatures with enormous wings and sinister smiles stood in the air and arrogantly watched as some humans set fire to everything below them. The scene that unfolded below them exemplified hopelessness in its purest form. Kevin was dragged by his parents through the streets of the village in a solemn and hushed manner as they ran along the crumbling roads and hellish flames. Huff, honey, quick over here. Turning left from a building, Jonathan gestured with his hand. Soon after that, the couple saw a modest house off in the distance. and they made their way there as quickly as they could. Crash! Jonathan used his foot to forcefully break through a wooden door that led to the small house, and then he immediately hid inside the house after he had done so. After setting Kevin down, Jonathan put his finger on his mouth and looked at Kevin with a serious expression on his face. Huff, huff, make sure you don't make a sound. There is no pee. Please, just remain quiet here, okay? The woman whispered while she placed her hand over Kevin's mouth and fought back the tears that were streaming down her cheeks. Please don't make a sound. As Kevin watched the solemn expressions on his parents' faces, he merely closed his eyes and maintained his silence while cradled in his mother's embrace. After that, there was complete and utter silence throughout the neighborhood for the subsequent 5 minutes. What pointless actions! Kevin wanted to tell them that staying here would only prove fatal, but seeing that they were refusing to listen to him, he just remained put. He didn't particularly feel anything out of the situation. The silence did not last for long. Boom! A jarring explosion occurred in the neighborhood of the house where they were all together, startling everyone. The aftereffects of the shock caused the windows of the house to shatter, which led to the destruction of a better part of the house. Get down. Covering both Kevin and his wife with his body, Jonathan dove down. A steady buzzing sound started up in everyone's ears a few seconds after the explosion went off, and it continued for some time after that. Ugh! It was a groan that brought Kevin back as he looked up to see his father having a difficult time standing up, his back covered in blood with large glass shards impaled on his body. Choni. Margaret, trembling and aware of the situation, couldn't help but cover her mouth in shock and grief. She gently caressed her husband's cheeks as hot tears streamed down her cheeks, trying not to make a sound. It's okay, I dash. Just as Jonathan was about to reassure his wife that he was okay, the sound of approaching footsteps startled them. Crutch. Crutch. He didn't think twice and shoved his wife away as he yelled, "Quickly run. I'll hold him back," with his eyes widening despite the back pain he was experiencing. No. Jonathan. Margaret attempted to protest with a distressed expression, but she was immediately shoved by Jonathan, whose eyes were now bloodshot. Quick. Go. After a moment of hesitation, she ran out of the house with Kevin in her arms without looking back. Cuckoo, what have we got here? Soon after the woman and the child left, appearing from the other side of the door, a young man with long blonde hair appeared. Die, you bastard! Jonathan screamed as he shouted while staring intently at the young man and displaying a thick red hue all around his body. He may not have been talented, but he was still capable of using mana. Clike. Margaret searched for a place to hide upon entering a new residence and quickly discovered a small trapdoor. Yes. Clike. She was shocked to discover upon opening the trapdoor that the space beneath it could only accommodate one small child. However, instead of despair, a look of relief appeared on the woman's face. With a look of determination, she placed Kevin inside the small compartment. Get in here. She pointed at the small gap. Here, hide over here. No matter what you hear, don't make a sound, please. Margaret suddenly bit her lips as she tenderly looked at Kevin. I will now go help your dad. I don't know if I will be back, but could you say a couple of words to me? Staring at his mother, Kevin's eyes remained unperturbed, and he continued to remain quiet despite her request. Tears welled up on Margaret's face as blood started to spill from the bottom of her lip, and she looked down. In a low voice, she murmured, "It's okay, I understand. Thank you, and I love you." Clike. Immediately after closing the trapdoor, Kevin's vision became dim. A couple of minutes after the trapdoor was shut, he heard muffled explosions not far from where he was. Though unsure, he could also make out the faint sound of a woman's scream. He wasn't exactly sure if it belonged to his mother or not, but he didn't really put much thought into it as he closed his eyes and hid his presence. It looks like they have served their purposes. Boom. Boom. This went on for a few more minutes before it finally came to an end. Shortly after that, there was a complete and total absence of sound in the surrounding area. Kevin crept out of the location he was in after an undetermined amount of time had passed, and he did so in a quiet manner. The dead body of his mother was the first thing he noticed when he emerged from the building. Her eyes were wide open and so was her mouth. From a glance, Kevin could tell that she had run out of the building and screamed her lungs out to attract the attention of the demons away from him. Why? Kevin wondered. He truly didn't understand why she would sacrifice her life for him. The same was true for his father, who showed a similar reaction when he foolishly dove into the arms of a demon. Could this be the records? Kevin had a sudden thought and soon came to the conclusion that their foolish actions must have been due to the records. If not, why would anyone try to do something as foolish as sacrificing their own life for someone else? Ding! Suddenly, a low chime echoed in his ears and a blue panel appeared in front of him. System activating. 13%. Loading. It was at this moment that Kevin's feet came to a pause and he murmured, "It's here." Chapter 687 The Chosen One, 3. Bang! A figure crashed against a series of buildings, sending them crumbling to the ground. With another muffled blast, the figure crashed against the ground, and a crater formed around the area around him. Following the dispersal of the debris and subsequent clearing of the area, Kevin's haggard figure appeared to be seen standing in the midst of the debris. His clothing was ripped and he appeared to have a gaping wound in his chest. His red eyes gleamed under the red, apocalyptic sun that hung in the sky, matching its intensity. How pitifully weak. A figure with white hair descended from the sky above him in a slow and collected manner. His presence loomed over the world, and his towering figure oppressed anything within its sights. He looked no different than a god that had descended upon the mortal world, as his every movement caused the world to shake. "I'm rather disappointed." Jezebeth spoke while maintaining eye contact with Kevin, who was standing below him. His icy stare was filled with what could only be described as disappointment, and he raised his hand. Palm facing Kevin, he mumbled, "If you're really all the records have planned in order to stop me, then I really am disappointed." Boom. The world tore apart and Kevin's vision grew black. "Come eat your soup, Kevin." Kevin's ears rang with the sound of a familiar voice as he looked down and took a quick glance at the meal that was in front of him. It was a straightforward yellow clear soup mixed with a few different vegetables ranging from carrots, broccoli and the like. It's bland and the nutritional value is low, Kevin thought as he brought the soup to his mouth. The taste of the soup was extremely bland, and it never seemed to fill him even though he was once again 5 years old. The only reason he never grumbled was because he understood that this was the best his caretakers had to offer. A simple vegetable soup. Kevin, in all candor, did not comprehend why the records would assign him to such inept caretakers. However, he was not programmed to question the system's decision-making. The only thing he needed to do was follow orders. But, why do you take care of me? There was still a lingering sense of curiosity in his heart, and he just couldn't help but bring himself to ask his caretaker the one question that had been in his mind ever since his first life. Why would such a creature risk so much in taking care of him when they couldn't even take care of themselves? Wouldn't it be more appropriate for them if they just abandoned him and lived for themselves? If that were the case, then they wouldn't be experiencing nearly as much suffering as they were right now. On the contrary, their quality of life for them would significantly improve. He was nothing but a burden, and Kevin wouldn't really think anything of it if they got rid of him. He knew that he was nothing but a nuisance to them. All in all, it was the most logical decision. Why do I take care of you? Kevin caught a fleeting glimpse of his mother looking at him with a friendly grin on her face as she turned her head and lightly winked her eye. Moving toward where he was, she kneeled down slightly and caressed his cheek. "I'm your mother. Why wouldn't I take care of you? Are I not a burden?" Kevin asked, his face expressionless. His mother's expression changed to one of surprise as she listened to his words, and then she smiled broadly and pulled him closer to her. "Burden? Why would you ever be a burden? My life has never been more fulfilled now that you're with me. I'm sure your father thinks the same." Feeling the soft and warm embrace of his mother, Kevin didn't say anything more. He was more confused than before. The sound of his mother's voice was what broke him out of his reverie as she suddenly squeezed him more tightly in her embrace. "Oh right, you spoke. It's such a rare occasion that I didn't even notice it." Her sudden burst of excitement once again made Kevin confused. Why is she showing such a reaction for such a trivial thing? Humans. They were creatures far more confusing than he thought. Ding. System configured. 100%. Time passed and the same scenes from the first life repeated themselves. The demons came and his parents died trying to protect him. Kevin crouched down and stared at the lifeless body of his mother while he prodded her flesh with his finger. Why? As Kevin's mind replayed the events that had taken place in the subsequent minutes and seconds, he became even more perplexed. Kevin, move. He could still clearly remember his mother pushing him to the side in an effort to protect him from a demon, but she ended up being the one who was killed. Before his eyes, he witnessed the dismemberment of his mother, followed by his father dragging him away and hiding him in the same place as his previous life. I said that you didn't have to take care of me. Why did you do something so foolish? Kevin asked, poking at the dead carcass of his mother. His father, who was not too far away from where he stood, was completely mangled and he was no longer recognizable. Kevin sat on the ground and stared at his mother and father for an undetermined amount of time while they lay dead on the ground. Somehow his heart felt emptier than usual. He usually felt like this, but for some strange reason he felt even emptier. Why is that? When additional support arrived, he was whisked away from the area and placed in an orphanage before he even had a chance to realize a day had passed. After that point, life returned to how it had been before, and Kevin's progress in strength continued at a steady pace as the years went by. 25 years later. Once again, Kevin found himself standing in front of Jezebeth. His expressionless face was the same as it had been in the past. However, when compared to his previous life, Kevin was much more powerful in this one. It wasn't just by a little bit. It was by quite a large margin. In this life, he was able to become even more powerful than he had been in his previous life by combining the knowledge he gained from his previous life with the system given to him by the records. He also received instruction from the most skilled instructors, which contributed to his increased confidence. Simply put, he could swat his former self in just a couple of moves. He had improved that much. We look eerily familiar, don't we? Jezebeth's voice rang throughout the world, his eyes glossing over his body. With a raised eyebrow he asked, "You couldn't possible." Before he could finish his sentence, Kevin's hand was already raised, and a white hue began to emerge from it. It covered the entire world around him and Jezebeth's face changed. Kevin launched his attack not long after that, and a powerful wave of energy headed in Jezebeth's direction. Akashic laws. The expression of shock on Jezebeth's face didn't last for very long. Instead, he appeared to have realized something, as evidenced by the appearance of a faint smile on his face. I see. So you're the missing piece that I need in order to get to the records. His hand raised and Kevin's attack was instantly slashed in half, two deep lines forming on the land behind him. Not bad. Jezebeth muttered something under his breath as he looked at his hand, which was quivering and bleeding very slightly. Lowering his head to stare at Kevin, he smiled ever so slightly. I have to say, you're definitely strong. Strong enough to fight against me, but... Jezebeth shook his head. The world seemed to suddenly distort itself and lose its color with the sudden raise of his hand. Crack, crack. The sky began to fracture and everything beneath Jezebeth began to collapse. The world's oceans began to rise, the ground began to tear apart, and everything in the vicinity was obliterated into nothingness. In an instant, nearly half of the world's human population was annihilated, and 7 enormous fissures formed in the sky. Within those fissures, 7 powerful figures emerged, and behind them tens of thousands of other powerful figures appeared. The world came to a sudden standstill and the crimson sky started to darken. Stepping forward, one of the 7 powerful figures placed their hand on their chest and announced, "The Wrath clan makes their presence." Like a sonic wave, his voice boomed throughout the world. Glasses shattered at the sound of his voice, and the air around him trembled. Not wanting to be outdone, those behind him stepped forward and introduced themselves individually. The Pride clan makes their presence. The Sloth clan makes their presence. The Lust clan makes their presence. The Gluttony clan makes their presence. The Greed clan makes their presence. The Envy clan makes their presence. The 7 patriarchs of the 7 major clans had made their appearance, followed closely by thousands upon thousands of demons belonging to each and every one of the clans. Each and every one of them had expressions on their faces that were filled with obedience and submission. Do you understand now? Jezebeth gazed at Kevin, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous red hue. Kevin simply stared back at him without making any kind of facial expression. Underneath, his muscles were tensed and sweat had started to accumulate in the palm of his hands. Simply being in their presence was almost identical to being in Jezebeth's, and Kevin felt as though his entire body was becoming immobilized. You're strong, I will give you that, but in the end that's all you are. Even if I don't finish you myself, my kin will do it for me. Interlocking his hands behind his back, Jezebeth slowly turned around. Raising one of his hands in the sky and staring at the large army of demons, he quietly mumbled, "Get rid of him." And with that order, the 7 patriarchs moved at once, followed by the thousands of demons behind them. A terrifying battle ensued shortly after that. One that was sadly not in Kevin's favor. Just like in his last life, he once again died. Chapter 688, The Chosen One 4. Kevin's head was filled with a constant ringing sound, and he was just staring at the wooden table in front of him with no expression on his face. He had a silver spoon in his tiny hands which he was holding onto very tightly. I failed again. Kevin mumbled to himself, his eyes gradually losing focus. In contrast to the first time, this time he was defeated before even having the opportunity to engage in a meaningful conflict with Jezebeth. It turned out that he was not even powerful enough to defeat the army of demons that were at his disposal, let alone him who was even more powerful than them. Where did I go wrong? What am I missing? He did everything that the system told him. He did the missions and took advantage of the opportunities from his past life. He did everything yet still failed to accomplish his mission. Just what was he missing? Here's your food. The sound of his mother's voice jolted Kevin out of his reverie and brought him back to the present. When he raised his head, he saw her staring at him with the same friendly smile that he was so used to by this point. Placed in front of him was the same bland soup that she used to make for him in his past life. It was her signature soup, and one that she would start making as soon as he became 5 years old, which he had just reached not too long ago. Just a single look was enough to take his appetite away. Nonetheless, he still decided to eat it. As long as he got his nutrition in, he was fine. Slowly, Kevin took a mouthful of the soup and had a taste of it. When Kevin looked over at his mother, who was also looking at him intently, he noticed that his brows had suddenly arched a little bit. Is there anything wrong? Kevin didn't answer her. Instead, he blinked his eyes a couple of times. He lowered the spoon and took another mouthful. He wanted to double-check. It's good. Kevin mumbled aloud, savoring the flavor of the soup in his mouth. As soon as he said those words, his mother immediately displayed a look on her face that indicated she was surprised. However, Kevin didn't put much thought into it as he continued to eat the soup. Why does the soup taste better? For some odd reason, the bland soup that his mother made him wasn't as bland as it had been in the past. Why was that? I'm glad you like the soup. Kevin was startled when he felt a warm hand caress the top of his head, and he looked up to see his mother looking back at him with the same smile she always wore. Her hands were large and rough, unbefitting of her graceful and frail looks. With just a glance, Kevin could see that they were filled with calluses and cuts. It was obvious that these were the hands of someone who had been through a lot of adversity throughout their entire life. Kevin knew this better than anyone. After all, those hands looked no different than his after practicing with his sword for years on end. Another thing that Kevin observed about his mother was that whenever he was around her, she never appeared to be eating anything. She never did anything other than sit in the opposite chair from him and watch him eat the food. He never really put much thought into it in the past. But it was indeed strange. Maybe she also didn't like the soup? Kevin cocked his head to the side a little and pushed the bowl of soup forward toward his mother. His actions confused her as she asked, What's this? Eat it. Kevin pointed at the bowl and his mother blinked a couple of times, clearly confused by his actions. She eventually shook her head and smiled. I've already eaten, you can. Lies. Kevin cut her off. He knew beforehand that she had not eaten yet. He had been observing her since early in the morning. His mother's job was to collect garbage outside. In the sweltering heat, she would push a shopping cart that weighed at least 3 times as much as she did and walk for a couple of kilometers for a payment of approximately 10 U. The cart was filled with trash and she would sort the trash as she went. It was a grueling job that was looked down upon by most people, but it was also the only job she knew to do. Sometimes she would get less than what she worked for, but she never seemed to complain. She was a tough and tenacious woman, one that Kevin had been observing her the whole time, and he knew that she hadn't eaten yet. Margaret gave a quiet sigh and mumbled something to herself. Despite not speaking much, you're a sharp one. Sometimes I wonder if you're really 5. Taking another look at Kevin, she stood up and headed back to the kitchen. Don't worry and just eat your meal. I'm not hungry. Liar. Kevin inwardly mumbled. She had been staring at his soup with great concentration just a few minutes ago. Even though it was obvious that she was coveting his soup, she still turned it down when it was offered to her. Why was that? Kevin asked himself, once again confused by the way his mother behaved. He really didn't understand why she would go to such lengths to help a small burden like himself. Staring at the clear soup in front of him and seeing his reflection, Kevin put the spoon in and took another bite. It's cold. Yet so warm. Time continued to pass and Kevin spent most of his time observing his parents. While Jonathan's father went to the construction site to help build the new high-rise buildings in the inner city, his mother, Margaret, would always leave early in the morning to collect the trash outside. The total amount of pay that they received between the two of them was only 30 U per day, which was just about enough to get by each day. It was also because of this that Margaret decided to go somewhere else to collect trash. Outside of a shopping mall in the inner districts of the city. I'm sorry that I have to drag you along with me, Kevin, but I won't take too long. You can just stand there quietly and wait for me to finish work. Kevin nodded his head without saying anything. He did nothing more than take a seat on the staircase of the mall and watch his mother labor through the scorching heat of the day. Sweat dripped down the side of her face as she used a pair of worn-out gloves to collect trash from the trash cans placed around the mall. Despite the many stares she received from shoppers in the shopping mall, she continued to work diligently, occasionally flashing him a smile. It was her smile that caused Kevin to tilt his head further as he had a sudden thought. Dangerous. For a fleeting moment he thought that the smile was dangerous to himself. For the past few regressions he had never really cared to look at his caretakers and just single-mindedly pursued his own goals. But it was at this moment during his third regression that he started to have different thoughts in his mind. He just thought that maybe, just maybe, they didn't need to die like they did in the past. Maybe he could help them survive that calamity that was to come. No, they will be a burden. It was only a fleeting thought, however, as he quickly discarded the notion right away. Thinking further, they would serve as nothing but burdens if he let them live. He had a clear goal and he couldn't let anything distract him away from it. His eyes drifted away from his mother not long after, and his eyes paused on the busy streets in front of him. Kevin was confronted by a bustling crowd of people entering and exiting the large shopping center. He observed people walking with smiles on their faces and children playing with their parents with joy. Shortly thereafter, Kevin's eyes shifted away from their image and lingered on a small purple banknote on the street. 50 U. It was a 50 U banknote. In Kevin's mind, a trivial banknote. He was so accustomed to dealing with millions of U at the time during his previous 2 regressions that the note appeared to be nothing more than loose change to him. However, as his eyes wandered back to his mother and how hard she was working for only 10 U a day, Kevin's body moved in the direction of the banknote. What are you doing? Kevin was about to reach for the bill when a bald and imposing man grabbed him by the hand. He regarded Kevin with a ferocious glare plastered across his face. That's mine, kid. What do you think you're doing? Kevin didn't answer the man and just continued to emotionlessly stare at him. Should I just kill him? No, that will attract too much unwanted attention at the moment. At that moment, Kevin rejected the notion of killing the burly man. If he revealed his power in such a crowded street, he would attract unwelcome attention and may find himself in a situation he would find rather troublesome. After all, killing was prohibited. What's wrong? Are you mute? Kevin felt a couple of taps on the cheeks as the man pulled him up by the arm. Kevin's eyes gleamed with a dangerous gleam, and just as he was about to say something, a pair of frail hands grabbed the burly man by the arm. That's my child, please let go. The voice, which shook ever so slightly and seemed rather frail, caused the large man to immediately turn his attention to Margaret and then to the garments she was wearing, more specifically, her gloves which were holding onto his clothes. Ugh. The expression on his face shifted abruptly, and he pushed her away with a slap. Don't touch me with those filthy gloves. He dropped Kevin shortly after as he started patting the arm in which he had been touched. The look of utter disgust on his face became deeply etched in Kevin's mind. Just as Kevin was about to do something, he felt something embrace him from above, and it was at that moment that he realized that his mother had already come to him and was hugging him very tightly. Her scared yet calm voice echoed inside his ears. I'm sorry. My child didn't have any intentions. Is there any way we can repay you? Repay me? The bald man looked at his shirt and looked back at her. Buy me a new shirt. Oh, okay, how much is that? With a quivering voice, Margaret took out a small purse from her pocket, her hands trembling. The scene looked oddly familiar to Kevin, who was observing. 500 U. 500 U? As soon as Margaret heard those words, the color of her face immediately began to fade, and she looked up in utter disbelief. What? 500 U is nothing? Why are you making it seem like it's the end of the world for you? Ah, well, 500 U is a lot. You should have thought twice before dirtying my clothes with those hands. When the burly man took the next step, Kevin's mother suddenly felt like she needed to hold on to Kevin even more tightly, and it was exactly what she did, as wrapped her hands around him and squeezed more tightly. For some odd reason, Kevin didn't feel any discomfort and only had one thought in mind. Warm. His mother's embrace felt so warm. Why was that? Kevin wanted to understand what he was feeling, and it was at this moment that he realized something. Do they really have to die? Chapter 689, The Chosen One, 5. What has gotten into you? Margaret looked at Kevin with a helpless expression. Jonathan, who was standing beside her, also wore a similar expression. Kevin, you know that we need to work, right? If we can't work, we won't be able to pay our bills and continue living in this house. Standing in front of the door of the house and blocking the two of them from leaving was Kevin, who still wore the same expressionless look on his face. If there was one thing that was different about him, however, was that his eyes weren't as detached from reality like in the past. Of course, this wasn't a change that Kevin was aware of, as he currently stood in front of the door and stopped the two of them from leaving. Do not go to work today. Can you tell us why? Rather than being angry at Kevin's behavior, the two of them bent down and caressed his head. Kevin's face didn't change at their touch, and he repeated, "Do not go outside today." Yes, we understand that you don't want us to go outside today. But is there a reason? Margaret asked, her face completely calm and devoid of any frustration. The same was true for Jonathan, who sat on the ground outside the small apartment and curiously looked at Kevin. Seeing that he had gotten their attention, Kevin didn't say anything and hugged Margaret by the neck, startling her completely. It wasn't just her that was startled. His father, Jonathan, was also startled and also somewhat jealous. Both of them looked at each other with bewildered expressions. Their reactions were understandable. After all, this was the very first time in his life that Kevin showed any glimmer of affection toward the two of them, and they were naturally taken aback. They might listen to me if I do this. On the other hand, Kevin had different thoughts, as the sole reason for hugging them was to manipulate them into listening to his request. Since he couldn't reveal to them the exact reason why they couldn't go to work today, he could only try this method, which, in all fairness, seemed to be working quite well, as the two of them started hesitating about going to work. Of course, Kevin knew that this wasn't enough for him to convince them completely. It was hence why he reached out for his pocket and took out a 50 banknote. I found this outside. Contrary to Kevin's expectations, the faces of the couple changed completely the moment he took out the banknote and immediately asked, "Where did you get that from, Kevin? Don't tell me that you stole it, Kevin. You know that stealing is bad, right? Although our financial situation is not good, we would rather starve than steal." Under the barrage of questions, Kevin merely cocked his head and answered, "I didn't steal it. It was actually a lie." This note was, in fact, the same note from the bald guy from a while back. When everything was said and done and his mother handed him the money, Kevin secretly found the man and killed him, taking away all of his possessions. For some strange reason, Kevin felt a weird emotion while he looked for the man. It wasn't an emotion he was familiar with, but he recalled thinking that a quick death wouldn't be enough for him. Why exactly he was feeling that way, Kevin was still unsure. But if there was one thing he was sure about, it was that the man needed to at least know who had killed him. And it was exactly what Kevin did once he found him. He could still visibly recall the look of horror on the man's face as he pleaded for his life. Unfortunately for him, Kevin didn't care at all and killed him. In the last moments before his death, Kevin looked at him with the same expression that he had previously shown. One of utter disgust. "Then where did you get this from?" Jonathan asked, his tone sounding a lot calmer than it initially was. Lifting his head to stare at his father, Kevin answered, "I picked it up from the ground." This wasn't necessarily a lie. He had indeed picked up the note from the ground. "Are you lying to me, Kevin?" "No." Kevin shook his head, his face completely expressionless. For the next minute, the two stared at each other without saying anything before Jonathan eventually sighed and stood up. "All right then. I trust my son. Since he is going this far to stop us from leaving, I guess I won't go to work today. Let me go give my boss a call today." Scratching the back of his head, he left the room and went back into the house, leaving Kevin alone with his mother, who was staring back at him. She eventually flashed a warm smile and caressed him on the head. "Very well, Kevin. We won't go to work today." Kevin watched as his mother stood up and headed for the kitchen. Pulling down her sleeves, she murmured aloud, "All right then, since we have time, I might as well make my usual soup." For a fleeting moment, Kevin started to regret his actions. It was only a fleeting moment, however. At the moment, he didn't want either one of his parents to die. At least not until he understood the emotions that he was feeling. For quite a while they had been bugging him, and he wanted nothing more than to understand them, for they may be able to, in some way, help him defeat Jezebeth. Turning around to stare at the wooden door of the house, Kevin thought to himself, since the incident happens quite far from here, they should be safe for now. Back then, it happened while he was coming back from kindergarten, which was quite far from his house. It was close to his father's job, which was why they chose to bring him there, but the distance from his house was still a couple of kilometers away. Last he recalled, this area wasn't affected by the demon attack since it was further away from the inner city. At least that was what Kevin thought. Bang, bang, run. Bring Kevin somewhere safe. Al-Ho-Eok. Watching his father get engulfed by flames as his body burned to a crisp right before his very eyes, and feeling an arm wrap around his waist, dragging him away from his house, which was rapidly getting engulfed by the flames, Kevin felt the world around him move in slow motion as his brain stopped working for a moment. "Shh. Kevin, hide in here. Make sure you don't make any sound, okay?" Plank. Same scene but a different scenario. By the time Kevin regained clarity over his mind, he was standing in front of the corpse of his mother and what little remained of his father. He just blankly stood in front of them for who knew how long, and something warm trickled down the side of his right cheek. Raising his hand to touch his cheek, he found that his finger had been stained by one singular tear. Staring at his finger, Kevin mumbled, "Why? You want to leave the village for a day?" It was Kevin's fourth regression, and once again he was presented with the same scenario as in the past. Just like his previous regressions, he died at the hands of Jezebeth. This time, however, he was able to survive the onslaught of all the demons. Unfortunately, by the time he had killed all of them, he was already exhausted, and all it took was a single finger for Jezebeth to get rid of him. Time rewinded, and Kevin found himself back in the past once more. This time he decided to approach things differently. Thinking about his parents and how they died in his previous regressions, Kevin decided to approach things differently. He wanted to understand what he felt during his previous regression. It was something that had been haunting him for his entire third life, and he was desperate to know the answer. This time, Kevin decided to go directly out of the city. By going out of the city, they would easily be able to avoid the demons. Although Kevin was strong for his age, he was still a lot weaker than the demons. Had it not been for that, he would have done something himself about the demons. "Why do you want to go out of the village? Is there something that's going on?" "I want to go out. I've never been out." Kevin flatly answered and pulled the same stunt as he did in his past life. He took out the banknote and flashed it before their eyes. Similarly to his last life, the two of them looked startled at first when he pulled out the banknote, but were able to quickly calm themselves down shortly after. In the end, Kevin was able to achieve his goal, and his parents decided to bring him out of the city for half a day. At this moment, they were all seated inside a large green bus. The fare ticket for the three of them was 5 U each, and in total they spent 15 U for the three of them. Kevin gazed at the ever-changing scenery outside of his window. Reflected on the window was himself. His gaze fell on his own emotionless eyes that stared back at him, and time seemed to slowly pass. "Do you like what you see?" It was his mother's voice that brought him out of his thoughts. When Kevin turned his head to look at her, rather than answering her question, he asked something of his own. "Why did you listen to my request?" This was something that Kevin wanted to understand. Although he had pulled out 50 U in order to convince them, he knew fairly well that they could have still chosen to go to work and delayed the trip to another day. What he wanted to understand was why. Why were they doing so much for him? It was really the records, wasn't it? Why did we listen to your request? Margaret seemed rather surprised by the sudden question. Meeting Kevin's line of sight, she smiled softly and Kevin felt her hand caress his head once more. By now he had grown accustomed to this gesture of hers. Love is when one puts the needs of someone else before their own. Putting your needs above mine is how I show you that I love you. Isn't that what every mother should do? Love? Putting the needs of someone else before their own. Kevin blinked his eyes a couple of times, finding it difficult to understand exactly what she was trying to convey. At the same time, Kevin felt that he got closer to the answer that he had been seeking, only that. Out of nowhere, the bus swerved toward the right before flipping over its head. Glass shattered, and the bus continued to roll on itself 5 more times. By the time the bus stopped rolling, silence swept the surroundings and Kevin looked around him, his ears ringing constantly. Mother? Father? The first thing that Kevin did when the situation stabilized was to look for his parents. Only for him to be shocked to see them lying on the ground without a single breath. Kevin didn't need to look to understand that they were dead. Throb. When Kevin looked at the bodies of his mother and father, for some reason he had the sensation that something heavy was pressing down on his chest. It hurt. But before anything else, why did they die again? At the same time, he also recalled the scene in which the man exported them 500 U, an eerily similar number to the one exported by the woman in the kindergarten in his first regression. Was it a coincidence? Chapter 690, The Chosen One, 6. Why did it happen again? While sitting on the curb in front of the bus with a perplexed expression on his face, Kevin mused to himself about the situation. Why did they die again? He did everything that he was supposed to do. He didn't go toward the inner city and lead his parents away from home, yet they still died. This time by a road accident. The demons weren't even responsible for their deaths. Kevin's gaze lifted toward the clouds in the sky. Staring at the clouds that were moving ever so slowly in the sky, he had a sudden thought. I wanted to spend more time with them. Bang! Watch out, Kevin. Once more, Kevin watched as his parents threw their bodies over to protect him. This time their bodies were completely severed in half and blood spilt all over Kevin. The expressions of helplessness and anguish that they displayed just prior to passing away left an indelible mark on his mind as he could only watch them die in front of him. Crash! Get behind me, Kevin. Boom! Ah! Unbeknownst to him, the same events kept happening over and over again with each and every one of his regressions. Before Kevin even realized it, he had reached his 20th regression, and for the 20th time both of his parents had passed away right before his very eyes. This time it was due to an explosion that occurred outside of the city. Why? Kevin never managed to muster the required strength to come to the aid of his mother and father, no matter how many times he tried. Each time they would suffer a horrible death and he would be left all by himself once more. The heaviness in his heart, which had been barely noticeable at first, became increasingly obvious with each and every one of his regressions, and it intensified with the passing of his parents in all of the regressions. Over the course of those 20 regressions, he would have an immeasurably better chance of defeating Jezebeth. But despite his best efforts, he continued to fall short in every single one of his endeavors. Kevin understood that it was only a matter of time before he could beat Jezebeth. Be it 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, or a million regressions. Kevin had all the time in the world to accumulate experience and become stronger. Jezebeth was still ahead of him by quite a lot, but Kevin knew that his time would come very soon. In those times, with each regression, he would spend more and more time with his parents. By the time the 20th regression happened, he had spent at least a century of his life with them. He pretty much knew them like the back of his hand. And it was because of this that he found it more difficult to part ways with them every 5 years since his birth. After each of their deaths, he would experience a sharp pain, and the color that had been slowly developing in his vision would slowly fade away. This cruel cycle would continue indefinitely with no means of stopping. It was their fate. Oh, I'm over here, you bastards. Come and get me if you can. Don't forget about me. Go away. As Kevin watched his parents yell and scream at the top of their lungs, doing their best to divert the attention of the demon away from him, Kevin's chest began to feel as if it were being crushed under an enormous weight. Why? Why? He repeatedly wondered inside of his mind, his eyes drawn toward the scenes in the distance. Love is when one puts the needs of someone else before their own. Putting your needs above mine is how I show you that I love you. Isn't that what every mother should do? The words that Kevin's mother had told him during his fourth regression rang in Kevin's head, even though they were barely audible. Tears began to form in the corners of his eyes, trickling down the side of his cheek before softly landing on the hard ground beneath him. And it was during this time that he finally better understood the meaning of his mother's words. Extending his hand forward toward where his parents were, Kevin murmured, "Don't go. Don't leave me, sis." Many years later, Ashton City, Lock Library. Kevin's hand came to a stop near a particular word as he paged through a book about human emotions. Loneliness, the state of being alone and feeling sad about it. Loneliness causes people to feel empty, alone, and unwanted. People who are lonely often crave human contact, but their state of mind makes it more difficult to form connections with other people. A candle cast a dim light on the area around him, and he traced his finger across the definition that was in front of him with a light touch. For some reason he felt that the words strangely resonated with him. He didn't quite get it, but ever since the passing of his parents, he had the impression that the world, which seemed already to be devoid of meaning to him, had taken on an even more hollow quality. His goal had always been to better understand the sensations he was feeling. By now he was about 600 years old if one counted all of the regressions. Over the course of all that time, the sensation of emptiness that was eating away at his body gradually became worse, to the point where every breath felt suffocating. It was also why he was now in the library. It was so that he could better understand what he was feeling and find an answer to it. Kevin flipped the book over and looked at the cover of the book. R.W. Johnson's Guide to Human Emotion. It was a mistake for the records to have birthed me as a human, Kevin thought, staring at the book in front of him and gently placing his hand over it. The root of all of his problems at the moment was his identity. The identity of a human. A social being that thrived on what was known as emotions. Initially, Kevin believed that he would never be forced to deal with such pointless issues. However, as more time passed and regressions took place, Kevin realized that he was not an exception to the natural biological system of the being known as a human. He was aware that the fleeting sensations that he experienced in the immediate aftermath of the passing of his parents were classified as emotions. And he understood that he could not run away from them. Regardless of how much he might try to distance himself from the world or ignore whatever was happening around him, like the death of his parents or his own death, the biological system that he was born with was directly influencing his own thoughts and actions. It was this realization that made Kevin realize that he could no longer ignore the issue at hand. He had to better understand this so-called thing known as emotion. Clank. Kevin got out of his chair and grabbed the book that was on the table in front of him. He was on the verge of turning around to return the book when he suddenly became aware of a faint light off in the distance. There was someone else here? It was approximately 3 in the morning, and it was very strange to see someone still in the library at that time. Especially when considering that exam season has already passed. Kevin, upon turning around, saw a young, skinny man with jet black hair covering the front of his face. His face was currently glued to a large book, and beside him was a stack of books. Demon Anatomy. What to watch out for from a demon. Incurable curses and what is known about them. Kevin unknowingly found himself staring at the books that were piled up in front of the young man. In spite of the fact that his hair was covering his face, it was obvious that the young man was showing signs of anxiety, given the rapidity with which he was turning the pages of the books and the low mutterings that he was making. Mindbreaker curse. Mindbreaker curse. Where is it? Where is it? There must be a way. There has to be a way. Are you looking for the cure to the Mindbreaker curse? Kevin asked, stopping in front of the young man and startling him out of his seat. Clank. The seat in front of him fell back and hit the floor, resulting in a deafening crash. It was a good thing the librarian wasn't around because nothing good would have come of it. However, the young man's expression changed dramatically the moment his eyes landed on Kevin, nearly unable to hide his shock. You're Kevin Voss. You know me. Of course I know you. We're in the same class and you're the first ranked in our year. Oh. Kevin nodded his head in understanding. To be honest, he had never paid much attention to those in his class, so he was unaware of who the youth in front of him was. After all, this was the first time that he had actually gone to the lock, despite his past regressions. He had never felt the need to go to the lock in the past, which is why he had never gone there. However, after observing that his previous strategies were unsuccessful, He made the decision to use this opportunity to try something new and different. Did I perhaps bother you? Is this why you came to me? The young man carefully picked up the chair and rearranged it in its original position. He never made a single attempt to meet Kevin's line of sight and instead kept his gaze lowered, acting almost submissively in front of him. Kevin's reaction to his actions was to tilt his head slightly, as he was perplexed as to why exactly he would behave in the manner in which he did. However, his focus eventually returned to the books that were laid out on the table. He pointed at them. You were mumbling something about the Mindbreaker curse. Are you trying to find a cure for it? Ep. The young man flinched the moment he heard Kevin's words. Ignoring his odd behavior, Kevin already had an idea of what was going on and bluntly stated. There is no way for you to cure whoever you're trying to cure. The cure cannot be found on Earth. There's a cure. The young man inched closer to Kevin while slightly parting his hair and revealing a pair of deep blue eyes. Yes, but not on Earth. That's enough for me. The young man scratched the side of his neck, revealing a few red scars and crusts in the process. It was obvious that the young man had been scratching the same area repeatedly over and over again in the past. His subsequent actions, which included moving around, were even more peculiar after that. As he fixed his gaze on Kevin, the anxiety that was already visible on his face became even more pronounced. At the same time, his hands, which were hidden beneath the blue cardigan that he was wearing, grabbed Kevin by the shoulder. What is the name of the cure? Tell me. Let go of me. Kevin grabbed the young man's hands, which had been pressing against his shoulders, and pulled them away from him while staring him down with a chilly expression. What's the point of me telling you this piece of information? Even if you do know, you're never going to be able to get it. Give you. No. No. You don't understand. I need to know. I need to know. Kevin was in the middle of a sentence when he was interrupted by the young man who made his desperation obvious. Kevin quickly realized that there was no point in attempting to reason with the young man who stood in front of him. If you tell me, I will help you with anything you ask me to, please. Just as Kevin was about to refuse him again, he had a sudden thought. Feeling the book in his hand, he looked at the young man in front of him and asked, What's your name? My name. The young man looked up, exposing his deep blue eyes and frail face. Opening his mouth, he mumbled, It's over.